months now as a research fellow. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about my PhD research. So one of the main focuses of my PhD was this concept of connectedness to nature in the psychology literature, which is defined generally as a salient belief or sense that you're connected to the natural world in some important or profound way. I was interested in how this relates to pro-environmental tendencies, which consist of motivations, attitudes, values, behaviors, and so on. So I'm going to talk a bit about that and then explore some ways it might relate to medical education. So before getting into the PhD, I'll make a few observations based on how it appears from my relatively outside perspective, because I come from the psych background rather than the medical one. So firstly, medicine, nursing, and all of healthcare is fundamentally a pro-social phenomenon. It's true that people may have different motivations for working in this field, and maybe wealth, status, or other self-directed goals may come into play to various degrees. But what I mean is the mere existence of medical institutions is a manifestation of human prosociality. You wouldn't find hospitals and nurses in antisocial animals. Secondly, medical education is yet another manifestation of prosociality laid on top of this. You're helping others learn how to help others. So I had a quick look in the literature on motivations for pursuing medical careers, and I found a concept called medical idealism. So idealism in general is defined as the cherishing or pursuit of high or noble principles, purposes, or goals. So when applied to medicine, these goals and behaviors might look like this: improving quality of life and decreasing suffering for all humankind, volunteering and serving underserved peoples, concern for the health of society as a whole. So you could sum these up as a salient sense of valuing the welfare of others and of society or humanity as a whole. So some argue that these ideals are a defining feature of physicians, and that they're the kinds of things that attract students to medicine in the first place. You could also argue that in the face of growing disparities in health and access to healthcare, society has an ever greater need for physicians with idealistic and altruistic values. However, several studies show declining levels of medical idealism as students and residents progress through their training. This leads to decreased interest in working in underserved communities, feeling of less responsibility for the health of society, and an increased jadedness towards the medical profession. So to me, this decline in medical idealism represents an interesting problem. Why the decline, and what would it take for people to become realigned with these caring and compassionate broader ideals? You know, how might we revive the salience of these values so they can continue to orient us towards things we deem to be of deep importance? Now this parallels the initial question that drew me to my PhD topic. What kinds of psychological characteristics underpin a salient sense of deeply valuing nature? Perhaps you could call it environmental idealism. So that's the question that led me to this concept of connectedness to nature, because the literature consistently shows a positive relationship between perceived connection to nature and pro-environmental tendencies. That is, the greater the sense of connectedness to nature, the greater the pro-environmental attitudes, behaviors, motivations, values, and so on. The thing is, this positive trend between connectedness to nature and environmental tendencies is based on a wide variety of concepts. The most widely cited is the aptly named connectedness to nature scale. A similar concept is called connectivity with nature. There's inclusion of nature in the self, which is based on a widely cited concept in the literature on interpersonal relationships, called inclusion of other in the self. And this is a pretty common visual metaphor in that literature, with self and other representatives as circles that overlap to varying degrees. So it's also been applied to concepts like inclusion of community in the self, inclusion in group in the self, and allo-inclusive identity. There's interdependence with the environment, which is also based on a model from social psychology. And there's ecological self, metapersonal self-construal, which is an extension of the self-construal literature, again from social psychology. So many of these concepts are based on closely related concepts from the literature on interpersonal closeness. It's just that it's applied to this broader scope of nature rather than another social group or another person. So other closely related concepts expand in scope beyond just nature and try to capture perceptions of being connected to everything. So in my research, I cast a slightly wider net than just nature because I wanted to capture these seemingly similar concepts that had different scopes. So in many ways, these concepts seemed similar to each other. They're all describing some kind of salient sense of being connected to nature. But I made 3 observations that frustrated me and that made the literature hard to navigate. The first is that the language used to describe these concepts often varied, even within a given concept. There's talk of sharing an essence with nature. Sometimes this is expressed in religious or spiritual terms, sometimes in more concrete or physical terms, like sharing a common ancestor or being comprised of the same fundamental materials. Some say it's an intuition, some say it's a belief, some say it's an experience. Sometimes it's apparently contradictory. For example, there's talk of the self being transcended and seeing the self as a small part of a larger whole. But there's also talk of feeling as though the self expands to include all of nature. What does it mean for the self to be small and large, or transcended and expanded at the same time? The second observation was that this kind of variation in language existed within and between the self-report measures as well. And finally, not all of the self-report measures seem to reflect the conceptual work in their respective articles. For example, the connectedness to nature scale is argued by its authors to measure trait levels of feeling emotionally connected to the natural world. But the scale doesn't reflect this emotional aspect because, as these people argued, its items refer to beliefs or cognitions rather than emotions. So there's a lot of variation in the language. Maybe these are all just different ways of describing the same thing, and the language doesn't matter. But I think the language does matter. The variation in language might represent important underlying variation in various psychological constructs. But also, the language we use to describe or frame connectedness to nature might go on to have different effects on motivations and behaviors. So my first goal was to organize this variation into a typology. Initially, just to gain a better understanding for myself, but it eventually became the main part of my PhD once I went down the rabbit hole. So the typology has 3 dimensions. The first is scope. I've already alluded to this by pointing out that many connectedness to nature concepts are based on concepts from close relationships or social groups. And other closely related concepts extend to all of existence, so scope accommodates that variation. The second the second dimension is manifestation. So this literature tends to talk about connectedness to nature and related concepts, either as an experience, as an explicit belief, or a sense or feeling or intuition. The last dimension is perceived ontology. So if connection to nature is the perception of some kind of connection between self and nature, then perceived ontology refers to the perceived characteristics of this connection. And I found 3 themes in the literature: expansion, interdependence, and shared essence. So expansion is an inclusion of other in the self, represented here by a self circle encompassing the other circle. Interdependence is seeing the self as a small part of a larger symbiotic system, represented here as 2 interacting circles. And these 2 are quite different. Interdependence implies a small self in the context of a wider system. And expansion, on the other hand, implies a larger self, or identifying with the larger system as a whole. The third perceived ontology is essential, which is defined by the perception of a shared fundamental property between self and other. And I've depicted this using a visual metaphor of two waves arising out of the same ocean. So this might have spiritual connotations like a shared life force, but it also might have more physical connotations like believing in a common origin, like a shared ancestor. Concepts like a sense of shared humanity with other people, I think, would count as shared essence, but with a different scope to nature, with a scope that extends to humanity. So the typology defines connectedness to nature in a more thorough way than I'd previously seen in the literature. That is, connectedness to nature is a belief and or feeling and or experience that the self is connected to nature through interdependence with nature and or expansion to include nature in the self and or sharing an essence with nature. This typology also helped navigate the literature. So you can take a relevant concept and map it onto the typology. So let's begin with the most obvious concept for now, the original connectedness to nature scale. So it has a feeling manifestation that the authors explicitly distinguish from beliefs. As for the perceived ontology, the authors refer to nature as a community to which we belong. So that's a small self as part of nature, which edges towards interdependence. A sense of expanded self to include the natural world, such that destruction of the natural world is seen as self-destruction. So that's an expansion perceived ontology. It refers to the extent to which an individual includes nature within his or her cognitive representation of self. So that's expansion again. Feeling a part of the broader natural world. So another example of small self in nature rather than expanded self that includes nature. Egalitarian members of the broader natural community. So small self in nature again. That quote also has sense of kinship, which I think is an example of shared essence, and one's welfare as related to the welfare of the natural world, which I think edges towards interdependence. So you can map the concept onto the typology and see that it's quite a broad concept. It's got a feeling manifestation, a nature scope, obviously, strong expansion connotations with some interdependence and essential connotations as well. So that's the language describing the concept, but you can also do the same to the corresponding self-report scale, which has a nature scope, this is the scale by the way, a feeling manifestation, a belief manifestation, so this is inconsistent with the conceptual work behind the article, behind the scale, sorry, that claims it just has a feeling manifestation. As for perceived ontology, there's kinship and life force, which refers to shared essence. There's the idea that every organism has an important role and that my actions affect the natural world and that my own welfare and the natural world's welfare depend on each other. So these are all the interdependence perceived ontology. There's not anything explicitly referring to self-expansion, despite the conceptual background having a strong theme of self-expansion. In fact, there's more reference to a small self being part of nature than the other way around. However, more general words like oneness and disconnection or connection could tap that expansion, but also could tap any of the three perceived ontologies. So the self-report scale can be mapped onto the typology as well. A couple of things stand out for me. One is that this pattern's not quite the same as the pattern from the conceptual background. Another is that this scale measures a very general connection with nature because it covers a wide variety of subdimensions, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it's worth knowing. I did this kind of analysis with about 20 self-report measures that I found in the literature, and I found that not one distinguished between these three perceived ontologies. So this is a bit of a problem because if these are important distinctions, then the general relationship found in the literature between connection to nature and pro-environmental tendencies may be missing some nuance. But do these three perceived ontologies really represent important distinctions, or am I just seeing patterns in the language from my armchair? I mean, I would argue that they're a sensible way of organizing the variation, But to test it more thoroughly, I ran a factor analysis study focusing on this perceived ontology dimension and found strong support for it. So this factor analysis study was run with the help of, you may guess it, if you have a psych background, a sample of undergraduate psychology students. I compared the fit of the hypothesized model, which was that each of the 3 perceived ontologies form a unique factor, against the fits of all other possible combinations of the 3 perceived ontologies. So the hypothesized model had excellent fit, and a difference in chi-square test showed that it was significantly more likely than any of the other possible combinations. Now, I decided to spend the talk on the conceptual aspect rather than the implications of this typology for the relationship between connection to nature and pro-environmental tendencies. I'll just say that I did do another study using a path analysis that tested for differential relationships between the 3 perceived ontologies and pro-environmental tendencies, and they did have different effects, but the details will have to be for another time. I think these 3 perceived ontologies are interesting enough for now to bring back to this idea of medical idealism and its decline throughout training. So the first question I would ask is, to what extent are these themes I talked about in connectedness to nature recognizable in the different ways that you might be involved in healthcare? So if you reflect on moments you felt a particularly strong sense of care for a patient or a student, or the pursuit of helping others in general, what seems to underpin that for you? And whatever it is, does that fit within this typology somehow? Like, I'm not a medical professional, but I've come up with some possible examples that could be researched. So at the smaller scope, when working with a patient, do you ever feel a sense of common humanity, which is a shared essence concept? Did this underpin an increase in a sense of deeply caring for them? To what extent did a desire to play your part in the social network you're embedded in, an interdependence concept, contribute to your motivation to pursue a career in healthcare or medical education? When working in a surgical team, do you ever feel as though you share something deep with each other, perhaps like a family or like a group bound by common values? These would be shared essence concepts. Or how about your feeling like you're playing an important role in theatre, which is interdependence? Have you ever felt as though another's suffering was your own? And what did that do for your sense of caring for them? This could go in an undesirable direction if it's too overwhelming to continue being effective at your job, but no doubt this occurs. Do you even think it's important to keep salient the compassionate roots of healthcare careers? Would reinforcing these kinds of feelings or beliefs about connection to other people and society as a whole also reinforce a sense of deeply caring for the people you encounter in your profession and for the healthcare pursuit in general? If so, did this talk today spark anything for you about how you might reinforce the deeper values captured by medical idealism, both in yourself and in your students as they progress through training? So I'm going to leave it there with those questions to ponder. And thank you.